Hello and welcome to VVork. I'm Brian Watrous. This is the 8th in a 10-part video series in which I'm teaching you how to automate using vRealize Orchestrator. Now, in the previous video, we spent a good long while talking about a super important concept called parameter binding. If you haven't already watched that video, you should go back and watch video number 7. But in this video, what we're going to be doing is applying that knowledge about parameter binding and use that to work with input parameters like we have before, and potentially we could do output parameters, but they work essentially the same. But we're going to be working with input parameters and something we haven't worked with before called attributes. As you can see, I'm already logged into the vRO client, and in here I'm in design view looking at the workflows tab, and you can see the 2 hello world workflows we've already created. Now, in this demonstration, we're going to create one more hello world. It'll be our last one. And in the next video, we're going to, instead of doing hello world things, we're going to do real world things. But one last hello world. It's going to be similar to our first hello world. So why don't we start by duplicating hello world. So I'll right click hello world, and I will choose to duplicate the workflow. Now I'm going to call this one hello world 3. Not a terribly original name, and I'll just go with the defaults here. All right, in this new workflow, here's what's going to happen. This time what we're going to do is we're going to ask the user to tell us not just their name, we're going to ask the user, whoever's calling our workflow, to supply us through an input parameters both their first name and their last name. And then there's more to it than that, but let's start with that much. So we want to ask the caller the first name and last name. To get information from whoever or whatever is calling our workflow, we'll edit our workflow, go to the Inputs tab, and since we're going to ask 2 questions, first name and last name, I would create 2 input parameters. So click once, click twice. Now I'm going to rename this first variable because it's not a particularly good variable name. Instead, I'm going to give it another name, such as first name. Now you'll notice from here on out that the variable names I'm going to be typing are like this, first name. This naming scheme that I'm using, where I'm capitalizing certain letters in the name, is a convention. It's a naming scheme known as camel case. In case you're wondering why it's called camel case, let me type out the name camel case. See the hump in the middle of the variable name there? That's why it's called camel case. If that alone didn't explain it well enough, you can go to Wikipedia, search for camel case, and get a long explanation about what camel case is. But to keep things short here, not only do I use camel case for my variable names and other things like actions, camel case is very common in the Orchestrator world. And I would suggest that it actually be good of you to just follow that convention. All right, so we're going to create 2 variables, one called first name. It'll be type string, and since we're asking the user for their first name, I'll say first name for the description. Now, as you know, I could finish up this second input parameter by clicking the name, changing the name, maybe changing the type and the description. But there's something I want to illustrate a little later on. So even though I could create both variables right now, I'm just going to create one of them and delete the second. So we will have 2 input parameters, but right now I've only created one because I want to illustrate that you can create variables on the Inputs tab and bind them later. All right, now I'm going to go over to the schema here to start building our schema. As you can see, we already have part of the schema. This part of the schema is where we're going to say hello to whoever is calling our workflow. So why don't we make a slight change to it? I'm going to click on the pencil icon. I'm going to go to scripting. And again, instead of saying hello world, I'm going to say hello first name. Now you'll notice that the variable is black. The little pop quiz here, you might want to hit pause and think about this. Why is that variable black? Why isn't it pink? Again, pause if you want to think about that. The reason why that variable is black is because we haven't bound it to the input parameter that we just created. Well, you guys already know that we can go to the Inputs tab to create a variable and then to the In tab to bind to it. So I'm going to do that right now. I'm going to bind inwardly by clicking the In tab and then clicking on the binding button. And as you can see here, I only have one choice. That choice is the variable called, the input parameter called first name, and I'm going to select it. So now I've set up variable binding for that one variable, but I needed two variables. And you saw a few moments ago, I was on the Inputs tab, I was creating the second input parameter, but I want to illustrate a point here, which is that while it's a good habit to be in creating input parameters from the Inputs tab and then binding to them on the In tab, you can actually do both steps, creating and binding, in one shot. To do so, you go to the In tab, click on the binding button, and instead of picking a variable, up above there you'll notice it gives you the opportunity to create a new variable, either an input parameter or an attribute in this case. So I'm doing in effect the same thing. It's kind of like going to the Inputs tab to create the variable, then the In tab to bind to it, but I'm going to do it all in one step by clicking on this link. A window pops up, and in this window, what this window is offering to do for me is to create an input parameter or create an attribute. I can say which I want down here. In this case, I want an input parameter, so I'm going to change that down there. By the way, you may have noticed that when I did so, this value field effectively got grayed out. I can't change the value because the whole point of an input parameter is the developer is not going to send in the value for this variable, but rather the end user is. So if I had said an attribute, the developer, can change the value of the attribute, but I can't change the value of the input parameter. The user is going to do that. So we're creating an input parameter, and my input parameter needs to have a name. As you can see here, it's giving us a default name of param. We could probably come up with a better name, such as, let's see, the next variable will be last name. Now, as a little aside here, if you ever see Orchestrator in this particular create parameter wizard, if you ever see Orchestrator sticking a number on the end of the variable, chances are, even though Orchestrator is trying to help you there, chances are you're about to make a big mess that's not going to be very fun to clean up. I want to focus on other things in this particular video, so I'm not going to explain right now why I'm saying this precisely, but trust me, having worked with lots of folks beginning with Orchestrator, and by lots I mean hundreds of people, I know that this is a frequent source of confusion. If you see Orchestrator sticking a number on the end of the variable, just stop. If you're in the classroom with me, come join me in class. If you're in the classroom with me, I'd say stop and call me over, and we'll investigate what's going on. I don't have that luxury here on the video, so I'll explain the issue later on. But for now, let's go with the variable name that we originally intended, last name. I get to describe my variable, and again, since this is an input parameter, this is the prompt that the user is going to see. So I'm going to make certain I type something that the user is going to understand. Now I can set the type of the variable, but string, the default, is fine. And I could create an array of strings if I wanted to, but I'm going to go with a single one. Again, I can choose input parameter or attribute. In this case, I want an input parameter. If I click OK, I now have two variables that are local to the schema element. Let me actually scoot this down so you can see things. I have two variables defined within this schema element. One's called first name, one's called last name, and they happen to be linked to variables of the same name in my workflow called in first name and last name, and they're both input parameters. So the schema element variables are linked to my input parameters. So at this point here, we could certainly do something like this. We could come in and say, hello, first name plus, click on last name. And if we want to be really fancy here, we could put in a space between them. So instead of saying, hello, Brian Watrous, it would say, hello, Brian space Watrous. And this would be all fine and dandy. In fact, why don't we actually run this workflow and just make certain that it works. We're not quite done here, because as you may have noticed, we haven't created any attributes yet. But let's go ahead and run the workflow, see how it goes. We'll validate it, looks valid. We'll run it. We'll say first name is Brian, last name is Watrous. And when we run this workflow, let's see if it works. We'll go look at the logs tab. The workflow ran successfully. We look at the logs tab and notice it says, hello, Brian Watrous. So that works great. But while we've been doing some variable binding here and working with input parameters, what we really want to do in this video is to introduce attributes, because those are definitely going to force you to do parameter binding. So what I'm going to do, and I'll explain why in a moment here, I'm going to go create an attribute. As you know, we do that by going to the General tab, scrolling down, and clicking on the Add button. I'm going to create an attribute called full name. I'll click OK. It's going to be a string, and I'm going to type a description. I'll say the caller's full name. And in the case of an attribute, you, the developer, have the option to set the value of this variable that we're creating or not. Sometimes as the developer, you'll set the value of an attribute to hard code its value, to preset its value. Other times you'll leave it blank because elsewhere in the workflow, you'll programmatically set its value. In this particular case, it's the latter. We're not going to bother setting this thing's value because we're going to have the workflow set the value of full name. And as I suspect you've already figured out, the way we're going to do that is we're going to, in our workflow, say that full name equals first name plus last name. So we're going to do that. And to make this a little trickier, in order to help you understand parameter binding, we're going to do the following. We could do the full name equals first name plus last name here in this schema element, but we're going to intentionally drag out another schema element and position it before the first schema element. I'm going to change its name to something descriptive, its label I should say, to something descriptive like build full name. So the purpose of this first schema element is it's going to set the value of that full name variable, and then the say hello workflow is going to print the value of that variable. To do this, we need to do some binding. And we're going to do the binding, but let's actually just go type the code first. We'll edit the build name schema element, go to the scripting tab, and I'll just go ahead and type the code. Full name equals, notice the variable's black because we haven't done any parameter binding, but full name equals first name plus last name. And again, extra credit if you remember to come in here and put a space between the first name and last name. So this code is syntactically correct, but it's not going to work because we haven't set up the binding. Now, I'll encourage you to hit the pause button here. It's pop quiz time again. Hit the pause button to actually stop and think about the answer to the following question. My question for you is, which of these variables do we need to set up parameter binding, and in what direction? Do we need inward bindings or outward bindings? So answer that question, if you will, for full name, first name, and last name. Again, hit the pause button because I'm going to give you the answer here in just a moment. All right, so the answer here is that in order to be able to run this code, we're going to need to have an inward binding to first name and an inward binding to last name, because we need to see what's in those if we're going to take their current value and smush them together. Smush is not a technical term. The technical term is we're concatenating them together. Layman's term is join them together. Whatever you want to call it, we cannot do this part of the code unless we can read what's in those variables. So inward bindings for first name and last name. We'll set that up in a moment. For full name, what we need is an outward binding. And one of the biggest tip-offs here is whenever you see equal sign, the variable that's on the left of the equal sign is used for making assignments. The variable that's on the left side of the equal sign, what's going to happen to it is we're attempting to change its value. And as you recall from the previous video when we talked about inward binding versus outward binding, you have to have outward binding in order to change the value of a variable. So again, we need an outward binding for full name an inward binding for first name and an inward binding for last name. And we're going to use our previous technique. I sure do want to use the visual binding, but we're going to save that for the next video. So one more time using the the in and out tab technique. So for those two variables, those two input parameters that are needing inward bindings, I'll go to the in tab. I'll click the bind button. I see all three variables, both the input parameters and the attribute, because all of those are potentially valid candidates for inward binding. But I only need, in this case, to be able to read what's in the first name and last name input parameters. So I'll go ahead and click select, and I've now set those up, and notice over in my scripting code that those variables are no longer black. They're this pinkish, purplish, whatever color that is. But full name is still black. And as you recall, that means that there's no binding to it. And as you also recall, we just figured out that we need an outward binding. So I'm going to go to the Out tab this time, and I'm going to do essentially the same thing. I'm going to click on the binding button, and notice in this case I only see one variable this time, because every time you look at this chooser window screen where it's asking you to pick the variables to bind, if we're on the, let me scoot this over here, if we're on the Out tab, all you'll ever see here is output parameters and attributes. I don't have any output parameters defined. All I have is this one attribute. But on the Out tab, you'll only see output parameters and attributes. On the In tab, you'll only see input parameters and attributes. Input parameters only show up one place, output parameters only show up another place, but attributes show up in both the In tab and the Out tab. Now I've said all that, now I don't remember what I'm doing. What am I doing? Let's look at our workflow. So in this schema element, in order to do the assignment to full name, we need an outward binding to the full name variable. So we'll select full name, click select, and now we've set up our bindings correctly. We'll double check by looking at the color coding here. Yep, we've got the binding set up correctly so that when this schema element runs, we'll be able to see what's in these two input parameters, first name, last name, and we'll be able to shove them together, concatenate them, and stick the concatenated string into full name. And since we have the outward binding, then the value of the full name attribute will change throughout the workflow. Anybody in any other schema element that reads in what's in full name will be able to see the value that we just concatenated. By the way, here's a little trick. I'm just about to go over to the, so as an added bonus here, here's a trick. I'm just about to go over and look at the scripting tab and the in-out tab for this say hello schema element. In other words, I'm switching from here to here. If you're like most folks, the way you do that is you close this editor window and then you come over here and click on the pencil icon. But if you just want to switch between schema elements, you do not have to close. You can just simply click on the schema element that you want to go to. So notice the editor is changing depending upon which schema element I'm clicking on. So I want to go over to this schema element, and this time instead of cheating and using the first name, last name, what we're going to do, we went through all that trouble to create the full name attribute. But notice here in the code, even though I've spelled the name of the attribute correctly, the attribute is black because we need to do some variable binding. Again, you might want to hit the pause button here because I'm going to ask you a question and it's useful to think about the answers before I just give it to you. So hit pause here in a moment. What kind of binding do we need here? What kind of binding, in order to outward, do we need for the full name variable? Again, hit pause because I'm about to give the answer. The binding that we need in this case is an inward binding. Now, for some folks, when you first start seeing this, that might seem strange because over in this other schema element, we did an outward binding. Why are we now needing an inward binding? Why are we doing an outward binding to the variable here, but an inward binding here? Well, the answer is actually pretty simple. It's just simply the fact that we're using the full name variable in different ways in these two different schema elements. So depending upon what you're doing with the schema element, as you go, depending upon what you're doing with the variable within a schema element, you'll need either an inward or outward binding. So hope you got that pop quiz right. We need an inward binding. Now you guys know how to do that. We'll go over to the In tab. We'll click the binding. Wait a second. In theory, what we want to do is go click the binding button. In fact, we'll do that, but I'm a little concerned about these here. We'll come back to those. I'm going to click on the binding button, and I don't want these other two variables, although I've already imported them, I've already bound to them. All I really want is this full name variable. I want to have an inward binding. But notice I've now got three variables. Two are input parameters, one's an attribute. They're all set up for inward binding, but the code over here only needs one of those variables. I'm bringing in, through an inward binding, all three variables. So what do? To deal with this problem, you can simply select the variable that you don't want a binding to anymore, click the X button, and now you've cleaned up that little mess. It wasn't a super big mess. Your workflow would still run, but having extra bindings that you're not using, to put it bluntly, is sloppy, but to be a little less blunt, having extra bindings lying around is problematic because it can be challenging enough just to set up the bindings right, but having extra bindings lying around can cause you confusion, and it most certainly can cause your fellow developers who are trying to debug or trying to modify your workflow. So I'm going to get rid of these extra bindings that I don't need. All right, looking at my scripting code, that's looking pretty good. I'll click the close button. I'll validate my workflow. My workflow is valid. I'm feeling pretty confident here. I'm going to save and close the workflow. And I'm going to run that new workflow. So we'll click run. I'll pass in a new name to make certain that this is truly working and it's not the previous version of this workflow. I'm going to use a different name here. I'll say Bozo the Clown. So Bozo Clown is the name. We'll click submit. The workflow starts running. I see its token. I see the token's done running. I could look at these other tabs, but the one I'm really interested in is the logs tab. And notice that what we see here is hello Bozo Clown. So hello Bozo the Clown. Our workflow is working correctly. Now I know these hello worlds can be kind of boring, but if you really want to understand parameter binding, there's enough going on in this Hello World 3 example that if you can really do Hello World 3, if you can do Hello World 3 from scratch and be able to do it automatically, if you can do Hello World 3 from scratch, then you're in great shape with parameter binding. So even though I know you probably want to get into the next video where we're going to be doing some real world things, it is worth taking the time to repeatedly, if necessary, to recreate Hello World 3 from scratch, and then recreate Hello World 3 from scratch, then recreate Hello World 3 from scratch. It contains all the elements and aspects of parameter binding that you need to master. Okay, so maybe you'll do that, maybe you won't, but one way or another, whether it's after doing that repetitive Hello World 3 or you just jump to it, come on over to video number 9 in this video series, because in that one, we're going to start taking all these skills that we've been gathering and we're going to start doing some real world things. So see you over in video 9.